Welcome to Hometowns and Heroes, a television award show saluting community hometown heroes from the country and internationally, honoring each of them with the recognition they deserve. Today, we'll see why they are our hometown heroes. And now, here are Mark Stewart and Rebecca Blackwell, your hosts for the show.
I'm Mark Stewart from Hometowns and Heroes, and today we're at Skyline Regional Park here in Buckeye, Arizona, one of the fastest growing communities in the West. And this is the perfect place to introduce to you some of the hometown heroes that have been featured on DirecTV, giving more of themselves, making this a better country. And to start off the show, let's meet Rebecca Blackwell.
Hello and welcome to Hometowns and Heroes. I'm Rebecca Blackwell and I'm here along with Mark Stewart. Hometowns and Heroes is not just a TV show. It's an opportunity to honor individuals who have done so much to make our world better. Our hometown hero today is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. You may have heard of him. Well, today you have an opportunity to hear him speak about his life as an American Muslim and his fight that he brings now to do jihad against jihad. Watch.
I'm Zuhdi Jasser, President of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. I'm currently a physician in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona, in the specialty of internal medicine and nuclear cardiology. I came to Phoenix, Arizona in 1999 after serving for 11 years in the U.S. Navy. I was on a Navy scholarship through medical school and grew up in Wisconsin. Went to medical school at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I grew up in a small town in Neenah, Wisconsin, about 40 miles south of Green Bay. My parents actually came to the U.S. in 1967, and I was born a few months after they got here. After my father finished his training at Tulane University in cardiology, he ended up going into private practice in Wisconsin in cardiology. As a kid in Neenah, I was an avid football fan. Green Bay Packers were one of the central parts of my life. I collected football cards. I still have about 6,000 of those football cards. Made sure I had almost every card I could. I remember I was proud to have John Brockington's rookie card, Walter Payton's rookie card. I loved listening to U2 and Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel, Phil Collins, Genesis. Those were the groups that I grew up with. The sports, I used to love playing tennis. I was on the high school tennis team. I also did karate, taekwondo for 7 years, ultimately getting a first-degree black belt in taekwondo. So most of my sports time was spent in martial arts through 7th, through senior year of high school.
So don't mess with you.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. One of the things that I did that was a big part of who I am was newspaper writing, and I was the editor of the high school newspaper in Neenah, Wisconsin. And actually, it's interesting, my high school just called me a week ago, and they are having they started a Hall of Fame for graduates, and I'm going out. This is the second year they're doing this, and I'm going out to speak to the assembly and talk to the students about what life is like after Neenah High School as one of their Hall of Fame graduates. So that was fascinating and quite humbling. They ultimately taught me that I could be more Muslim, more free to have a personal relationship with God and with my faith in America than I could in any so-called Muslim country and Muslim majority country. And, I think their story is very much what defined me, in that my father's family, for example, and his father, Zuhdi Jasser, had escaped Syria and were political refugees from Syria in 1966. My parents escaped through Lebanon and then came to the U.S. and after 3 months were able to get asylum here and really felt American the moment they got here. Not only appreciate the freedoms that we have, but give back to this country, and that was the reason I ultimately decided to marry my lifetime goals of wanting to be a physician and wanting to serve in the military. So I did both through the Health Profession Scholarship Program and was ultimately accepted to medical school at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and I did a 4-year Navy scholarship. I served 11 years, did my training at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington. I did serve a year on the USS El Paso before the Clinton administration decommissioned it, and half of the Navy at the time. But we went to Operation Restore Hope in Somalia. I joined the ship on its way back from there, and I then returned to Bethesda Naval to serve as their chief resident. And also then my last billet was as a physician to Congress, which was just an unbelievable experience in that there are 3 physicians in Congress. 2 of us worked for Admiral John Icehold, who was the attending physician to Congress, and we took care of all of the members of Congress in the Senate and the House, and also the 9 Supreme Court justices. So I was able to take care of Justice Scalia, Thomas, Sandra Day O'Connor, and others. You know, I have to tell you that serving as a physician to Congress, I had wished my grandfather was alive to see that, just because as Syrian refugees in the late 60s, they had seen America as the beacon of freedom, the city on the hill, and to be a physician in the halls of Congress was just an unbelievable experience.
Now let's meet Courtney Lonergan. She's a Muslim reformer who works with Dr. Jasser. Watch.
Hi, my name is Courtney Lonergan. I'm an applied cultural anthropologist, and I'm a grassroots community organizer. I was born and raised in Alaska, and I'm also a Muslim. I met Zuhdi Jasser it was after 9/11, and it was when they were looking for a facilitator for their Muslim Liberty Project retreat. And one of my colleagues at ASU recommended me. She's like, yeah, Courtney's a great community organizer, but she's also Muslim. And so I felt like it was a beautiful fit. And I realized going through notes from the past that there were several people who had said, do you know who Zuhdi Jasser is? You need to meet him. And I was like, no, I don't know who he is. And it ends up, I live just down the street from where his office is. So when we met, it was definitely meant to be. It's a great merging. I've got the skills to bring the people together, and he definitely has a background on what a lot of the key issues are. Just recently, we met in Washington, D.C., and we had 15 Muslim leaders from Europe, from North America, primarily from the United States and Canada, and folks that had traveled to the Middle East and Africa. And these were Muslim leaders, scholars, and imams who said, we need to come up with a solution. We know that there's this extreme politicalized ideology that is being pushed as Islam, and we know that we are a part of the solution. And so we created the Muslim Reform Movement. And what's behind the Muslim Reform Movement is a declaration that's based on 3 overarching principles to really start the dialogue with Muslims and our neighbors on the change that needs to happen within Muslim communities. First, it's around democratic, secular governance. The second one is around freedom of speech and freedom to offend. And the third is around basic human rights. A key piece of our declaration that got spread, we started a Facebook just the Friday after we held our conference. And within a week, we had 100,000 hits on Facebook. A young person in England set up a Facebook site for us for free. And at the top, he said, ideas don't have rights. Human beings have rights. So this has been an amazing movement that has gained a lot of ground over just a couple of months. And it was really Zuhdi Jasser's idea, his persistence, to bring together all of these key leaders and to have this authentic dialogue to help move us forward. I'm very proud to work with Zuhdi Jasser. He's a true American hero. I enjoy having Thanksgiving with his family, and I'm excited. He also has 3 children, and I do too. I'm excited for our children to grow up together.
I will tell you that the newspaper writing, I had a column in high school called On the Right Track, which was controversial because it was a conservative column, but I started writing it in 9th grade, and I did it for my 4 years in high school and ended up being the editor of our school newspaper. So, and then when I went to the University of Wisconsin, and in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about how the university setting, my parents built the first mosque in northern Wisconsin, and that mosque was in the small town of Neenah. There had not been any mosque in the entire region in northern Wisconsin, northeastern Wisconsin before that, and they built it right when I was in 6th grade, right in 1980. It was right after the hostage crisis. So there were some protests at the time, people that didn't want it built, and a lot of media attention. I remember my dad talking about how much he wanted, that their goal was just a regular place of worship, and did some education with the community, and ultimately it got built despite the protests, because as much as there were a few hundred people that were protesting its construction, the vast majority of the community welcomed us, and now it's the Fox River Valley Islamic Society. Fast forward to the university. I remember when I went to the university, I was very active politically in college Republicans and in the newspaper. We realized that there was one newspaper on campus. There hadn't been a conservative voice, so we asked for funding for a conservative newspaper, and we ultimately started a second newspaper in which some of us got another voice out, and that grew into the second university newspaper at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I started to get interactions, if you will, with Muslim student groups, including the Muslim Student Association, the General Union of Palestinian Students, and I quickly got an education and taught myself about what were political Islamic movements, and that there are many folks who, having learned my Islam in a small town in Wisconsin, just learning about Quran, scripture, personal faith, I didn't see any aspect of political Islam. I go to the university, and all of a sudden I learn about these large organizations called the Muslim Student Association that were connected to national organizations called the Islamic Society of North America, and I realized that my faith was not just about me personally, it was a political movement. Unfortunately, this political movement was very anti-American, it was anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and stood against many of the values as a conservative American Muslim growing up in a small town in Wisconsin that I thought were part of my faith. I still believe they were part of my faith, but I had to then quickly learn about the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic movements, and my time at the university really started my path towards understanding the need to reform against Islamists, who are basically those who believe our faith is completely connected to political Islam, and that the state identity, when Muslims are a majority, should be an Islamic identity, not simply a identity of liberty and freedom, which is what America is about, and that ultimately their political identity is less about principles of humanitarianism and more about principles of religious movements and evangelism and Islamism. So that I learned quickly at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I was on a Navy scholarship through medical school. I did my summers working in officer training and learning about the Navy. And I can tell you that my years in active duty were very formative for me as far as realizing that America is not only its principles, it's not only its history, it is a team of citizens that work together, that believe in one another. I remember we had interfaith discussions with the supply officer who was Mormon, the deck officer who was Jewish, my XO and CO who were Christian, and others of all faiths, and we would sit down and sometimes talk politics, sometimes talk religion, and we got to be very good friends. I was the doctor on the ship on the USS El Paso, and those are some friendships that I still have to this day, that I realized that my identity as an American was first, and they respected my faith, but also realized that at the time, radical Islam wasn't as much of an issue when we were in Somalia and others. This was way before 9/11. It was in 92, 93. But now when I hear from them, they are constantly talking to folks about, how much those years with me, they realize that there is a difference between Muslims that are Islamists and Muslims that are very pro-American. So I'm really glad that I chose to. It was natural for me to want to serve in the Navy. It basically married my two dreams, which was, one was to be a physician, and the other, I felt I had to serve my country and give back because of the freedom that my family got. Into the 90s, as I was serving in the Navy, I served until 1999, I felt that my work and my faith was, a significant part of my identity. I consider myself to be pretty orthodox in my faith practice. be it praying 5 times a day, fasting, participating when I can in mosques, and also learning about my faith, writing and reading about it. So I was always avidly engaged in understanding the local, national, and international community and where Islam was in its history. And my activities, I mean, let me give you an example. Before I left the Navy, if you go to the chapel at Bethesda Naval Hospital, you'll see the symbol on the chapel includes not only a cross, but a Jewish tablet and a crescent. And the chaplain, Captain Vieira at Bethesda Naval Hospital, reached out to me and said, you know, you and the head of endocrinology at the hospital are the only Muslims and the officers, but there are many other Muslims that need places to pray. So can you help us? And we interviewed some imams and had somebody come out on Fridays to do prayers. But ultimately, we then added the crescent as part of the faith fabric at the Naval Center. That was basically an example that exemplified my interaction. In my book, I talk about how when we interviewed the imams, there were some imams that came from the largest mosques in the area, and their interviews were horrific in that they really did not understand what it meant to be American. Their understanding of unit cohesion and principles of, how to balance being Muslim with being a Marine or being a naval officer was very problematic. And I talk about some of that in my book. But at the end of the day, to me, my work and my faith was all about these small little episodes of where it interfaced, and I tried to present a modern form of my faith. But I never looked at it as a legacy issue for national or global issues. Then I came to private practice, and I did get and started a group called the Children of Abraham, and that group was a group that we wanted to do between Muslims and Jews to begin a dialogue on how to create a conversation about Judaism and Islam between 10 families. And it was just unbelievable how that grew into then a discussion not only on Israel and Palestine, but about the entire similarities and differences in how to have interfaith discussions. I mentioned that to you because we had been meeting in that group for 1 year when then 9/11 happens. And I opened my book talking about 9/11 because on the next morning, that happened Tuesday morning, the next morning when they started to immediately talk about the fact that these were acts of terror and that we were attacked worse than we ever were, almost every one of the families in that Children of Abraham called me. We called each other to talk about what's happening. The newspaper called my father, who was involved in our Children of Abraham, to write an editorial about what is this Al-Qaeda's Islam and what is that all about, and it appeared 2 days later in the newspaper. But I had not been engaged in a public conversation as heavily about what's happening in radical Islam. Things settle in, and then November 2001, the Arizona Republic has a front page story that says U.S. Muslims torn between loyalty to America and loyalty to Islam. Long story. Dennis Wagner and another reporter who I talk about in my book, they interviewed every imam they could, and almost every imam blamed America, talked about conspiracy theories, apologized and gave apologetics about jihad. And I read this and I was horrified. So I called the reporters and I said, "Where did you find these people?" And they said, "Well, these are the Muslims that are your leadership in your local community. How else would we find any Muslims? We searched locally, and this is what we got." So they said, "Maybe you can channel your frustration into an editorial." I wrote an editorial saying the opposite of their title, that Muslims are not torn between loyalty, but that there are radical Muslims. And I especially named the individuals that they had interviewed as being representative of the problems of anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, and other aspects that need deep reforms. Well, that piece goes out. The newspaper published it fully. I received threats of being an Uncle Tom immediately from national organizations, from local mosques and imams who said that I didn't have a right to talk about them, etc. Meanwhile, their piece had gone out without any criticism from anybody, as if that was representative of the Muslim voices. So we then realized, many of us who were in agreement with me, that we needed to form an organization with a voice, because currently, clearly, the voices in the Islamic organizations locally that spoke for Muslims and Islamic organizations were part of this Islamist movement. And while they may not be terrorists and believe in that violence and that militancy, they're coming from the same pool of ideology, which is anti-Americanism, anti-secularism, anti-Westernism, and pro-Islamic State concepts. So we got together, 9 families in my house, met for 6 months, hashed out 17 principles that formed our organization, and put together a proposal for a 501c3 called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And to this day, the mission statement, now our mission statement is completely validated by the existence of ISIS, but this was 2003, and our mission statement was to protect the U.S. Constitution, freedom and liberty through the separation of mosque and state. People were like, when they saw this, they said, what does the mosque and state separation have to do with protecting freedom and liberty? And basically, that's our mission, because the disease, terrorism, is a symptom. The disease that fuels that is a supremacism, an identity that the best form of government to these radicals is an Islamic State. Forget whether there's militants or not. A much bigger problem, which is almost 20-30% of the world's Muslim population, believes in Islamic movements, Islamic parties, in which the government and their party platform should be based in Sharia law, should be based in a theocratic, type of system of government, and ultimately that the inspiration for their government and movements should be political Islam or Sharia law. The only counter to that is not just counterterrorism, but states believing in liberty, freedom, and Western ideas of freedom and the separation of church and state. And that's why America is the key. American Muslims who understand a country that fought against theocracy, in which our founding fathers fought for religious freedom as our first freedom, are really, I think, the penultimate example of how we can begin to take these same ideas of reform and begin to create its own Muslim identity for liberty against now the Islamic State, but against also every Islamic identity state, be it Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Egypt, etc., which are all swimming in that same pool of political Islam. So after we formed our organization, we launched nationally by having a rally against terrorism. It was called Standing with Muslims Against Terror. And in the book, I think you'll find it fascinating to look at all the struggles we had. Initially, Muslims were open to it, and then they didn't want the word terror in, and then the imams walked away because they wanted to talk about Israel, they wanted to talk about American terror in Iraq and other things, and it was just, demonstrative of their moral corruption in their inability to make a moral clarity statement, a morally clear statement against terror, and wanting to bring in excuses and other things that really shows that they're not condemning terror, they're the we condemn terror but crowd, and they don't want to look at the disease. It's almost like the alcoholic that's trying to legitimize, occasional or moderate use of alcohol, and not realizing that it's the substance that's the problem, and their personality of addiction to that substance that's causing the problem. So ultimately, we can't do this alone, and helping is super easy, in that I know it's easy to perceive of this as just a Muslim problem, but let me tell you something. If you wait for Muslims to do this on our own, the world will implode without your help. It just will. The Muslim community is often in denial, is often in fear because of being targeted, and is often part of the problem because of these Islamist petro-Islamic movements. So the first step in our business plan, in our strategy, if you will, is to wake up the 99% of America that's non-Muslim to the fact that, not that most Muslims are terrorists. I've met hardly any terrorists. The vast majority of Muslims condemn terrorism. But that Muslims have a significant problem with political Islam and theocracy. And that the majority don't believe in that, but yet aren't motivated, aren't feeling a sense of urgency to act. So what you can do is to teach and engage your politicians, engage your media, reporters, newspaper, social media, Facebook, engage your universities to have panels, engage your families, your faith communities, to have interfaith conversations between churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, to begin to have a conversation about our Muslim Reform Movement declaration. Use that as a piece of conversation to have a panel to engage about how Homeland Security is engaging the Muslim community. If they're going like the president went to a mosque that is a fundamentalist, Salafist mosque like he did in Baltimore, Americans should be in an uproar that doesn't represent the average, moderate, modern Muslim. Not to say they're terrorists, but to say that this is not, imagine saying that the Westboro Baptist Church is representative of Christian communities in America. That would just be absurd. So I think ultimately this is why we need your help, to build platforms, to get the word out. There's no better campaigners on the planet than the United States of America citizens. And we can push this message out domestically and then globally into Iraq, into Syria, into Egypt, so that the moderate majority of liberals who believe in liberty can then be empowered to have tools to do that. I mean, let me give you an example. The Arab Awakening, where you saw a turnover of governments in Egypt, Libya, Syria. Now, I know some may think those were bad things. Ultimately, they were opportunities and good things, because you can't get rid of radical Islam without a movement to, and not only radical Islamic groups, but the dictators that feed them. So those movements happened with Western technology. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter were all key elements of how that happened. So they used Western technology in their populist movements to change their governments, just as the Green Revolution in Iran tried to do that, and then we abandoned them in 2009. So I think this is where the American people, through an engagement of a sense of urgency, can work through businesses, corporate America, to begin to shift the needle away from simply saying, oh, let the Muslims figure it out, or let government figure it out. Government's not going to be... This is an internal problem within the House of Islam, and Americans need to take sides. It's easy. You can do it. Engage us on aifdemocracy.org at our website. Engage us on our other website for our Muslim Reform Movement at muslimreformmovement.org, which is a coalition of organizations. Our American Islamic Forum for Democracy was a convener of that movement. Engage me on Twitter at Dr.Zuhdi Jasser, D-R-Z-U-H-D-I Jasser. Engage me on Facebook at MZ Jasser, or at our organization at American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And our YouTube channel has interviews like this and others at AIFD TV.
So we need your help. And the best way for people to help is to go to muslimreformmovement.org. We have a website. You can sign our change.org petition. And we also have a Facebook site. And this is where Muslims and our neighbors can engage in this respectful dialogue to really bring about the change that we need. And so check us out on Facebook. And you can also find us at AIFD, American Islamic Forum for Democracy, here with Zuhdi Jasser. We're so proud that Zewdy is our hometown hero.
Well, thanks for being with us on this special edition of Hometowns and Heroes. I hope you enjoyed the show just as much as we enjoyed putting it together for you. All the best to you and yours, and we'll see you next week.
Join us again next time to hear another inspiring story featuring our next hometown hero. If you have a hero in your hometown, let us give them a hand.